Over the years, I've watched countless videos comparing Fallout 3 to New Vegas and Fallout 1 and 2, and I'm familiar with most of the common criticisms. Many of those critiques are valid, but Fallout 3 is also fun and still has a dedicated fan base despite its flaws. Because of that, I don't think the game needed to be fundamentally reworked to stand alongside New Vegas or the original Fallout games. With a few targeted changes to the writing, it could have been just as strong. In this video, I'm going to walk through how I would have approached writing Fallout 3 if I had been in the role of lead writer at Bethesda in 2008. This isn't a wish list of features or a pitch for a completely different game. Every critique and suggestion I make is something that could realistically have been implemented before Fallout 3 was released. I'm also taking into account the real-world constraints the developers were working under. The writers didn't have complete creative control. There was corporate oversight, budget limits, and hard deadlines that constrained them. For example, iconic elements like the Brotherhood of Steel and Super Mutants may have been mandated to appear, even if their presence on the East Coast wasn't an obvious fit. A writer's job in that situation isn't to remove those elements, but to make them feel coherent and justified within the setting. I'll also be mindful of the technical limitations of a 2008 Gamebryo engine title. I'm not going to suggest rebuilding the game from scratch, expanding the map, or adding large numbers of new factions or quests. Instead, I'll focus on changes that would have been relatively quick, inexpensive, and feasible. Small writing and structural adjustments that could have significantly improved the story without changing what Fallout 3 fundamentally is. Fallout 3 succeeds at imagery and atmosphere more than it does at structural storytelling. It gets a lot right conceptually. The problem isn't a lack of ideas, it's a lack of consistency in how those ideas are supported by lore and internal logic. In many ways, the story feels like someone's first draft of a novel getting released to the public. There are interesting parts and strong concepts, but it feels like it never had someone step back and really edit it. Someone whose job was to tighten the themes, smooth out the contradictions, and make sure the world actually operates by its own rules. The result is a game full of compelling ideas that don't always cohere into a believable setting. Fallout 3 has a lot of genuinely cool ideas, which is why I see it as a diamond in the rough rather than a lost cause, like Fallout 76 or Starfield. Megaton feels like a scrap metal frontier town, somewhere between the Wild West and Mad Max, built entirely out of the ruins of the old world. Washington, D.C. is a heap of rubble infested with super mutants, and the Talon Company are ruthless mercenaries stalking the wasteland in menacing black armor. It's also important to remember that Fallout 3 functioned as a soft reboot of the series. Nearly a decade had passed since Fallout 2, and Bethesda was introducing the franchise to an entirely new audience. Setting the game on the East Coast was a smart decision. It gave Bethesda the freedom to introduce new factions, ideas, and conflicts without being tied too tightly to the established history of the West Coast games. At the same time, completely severing ties with the earlier games would have been risky. Iconic elements from Fallout and Fallout 2, like established factions, were likely expected, both by fans and by corporate decision makers. The challenge then wasn't whether to include those elements, but how to integrate them in a way that felt natural and internally consistent. That's where Fallout 3 often stumbles. One common criticism of Fallout 3 is that Washington, D.C. is still too heavily ruined for a setting that takes place over 200 years after the Great War. I don't agree with that criticism. We rarely hear the same argument applied to places like Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, or Colorado, regions that, prior to Caesar's rise, were largely inhabited by small, fragmented tribal societies. If anything, those areas show that post-war development in the Fallout universe is highly uneven. Not every region rebounds into a complex civilization at the same pace. In that sense, California is the real outlier, not the baseline. The NCR represents an unusually successful case of post-war recovery. Even the Mojave was largely tribal until Mr. House reopened the strip. Real history shows us that collapses aren't clean resets. They're messy, uneven, and can stall progress for generations. An example is the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, when the highly interconnected civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean basically fell apart. The collapse caused entire civilizations to lose writing systems, urban centers, and specialized technologies for centuries, not because knowledge vanished overnight, but because the institutions and trade networks that sustained them collapsed. A similar pattern followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire, where political fragmentation and declining urbanization persisted for generations, and a worldwide nuclear war would likely likely be far more destructive than either of those collapses. They did not involve the near total destruction of industrial infrastructure across the entire planet. The more advanced and interconnected a society becomes, the harder it falls when its systems collapse. Modern societies are also highly specialized. Most people don't produce their own food, build their own homes, or manufacture their own tools. They depend on complex supply chains and institutions. When those systems collapse, knowledge may survive in theory, but access to it disappears. In a hyper-industrial, futuristic society like Fallout's pre-war America, that problem would be even more severe. Rebuilding basic production from scratch would take time. In that light, the slow and uneven recovery of the capital wasteland isn't inherently implausible, even 2 centuries later. The real issue isn't plausibility, it's explanation. The game rarely justifies the condition of the region. A few lines of dialogue or environmental storytelling could clarify that Washington, D.C. was a high-priority target and suffered more extensive bombardment than other regions. Or it could emphasize that constant pressure from groups like the Talon Company has prevented settlements from stabilizing or organizing on a larger scale. Another common criticism of Fallout 3 is the presence of super mutants in the capital wasteland, despite it being on the opposite side of the country from Mariposa Military Base in California, where the forced evolutionary virus was originally developed. Bethesda's solution was to establish Vault 87 as a local source of FEV, explaining the capital wasteland's super mutants as the result of experiments conducted there. While this technically explains their presence, it raises several problems. The Vault program was designed primarily around social and psychological experiments, not large-scale biological weapons research. And even if the U.S. government wanted to conduct additional FEV research, it's unclear why they would choose a civilian vault over a secure military installation like Mariposa. Spreading FEV research facilities across the country also makes the virus, and by extension the super mutants, feel less unique within the Fallout setting. That said, Vault 87 is one of Fallout 3's best locations. Exploring a vault overrun by super mutants, with gore bags hanging from the walls and evidence of failed experiments everywhere, is genuinely effective environmental storytelling. Vault 87 is a good example of Fallout 3's writing problems. Cool ideas that could have made sense if they were supported by a plausible backstory. The issue isn't that Vault 87 exists, it's that the game never provides a convincing reason why a vault would be used for this kind of research in the first place. With a few targeted changes, Bethesda could have kept everything players like about Vault 87 while grounding it more firmly in the established lore. A more plausible explanation would be to tie the Capital Wasteland's super mutants directly to the Enclave. In Fallout 2, the Enclave retrieves FEV samples from Mariposa and demonstrates both the knowledge and resources needed to study and modify the virus. Establishing an Enclave scientist at Raven Rock who continued FEV research would fit cleanly within existing lore. In this version, Vault 87 would be a control vault rather than an experimental one. A rogue Enclave scientist, operating without official approval, could have chosen the vault as a secure, self-sustaining facility with scientific infrastructure, a power source, and a sealed population of non-irradiated test subjects. That choice alone would justify both the vault's role and the origin of the Capital Wasteland's super mutants. This approach preserves Vault 87 as a location, preserves super mutants as enemies, and avoids introducing a second major FEV research facility. Another common criticism of Fallout 3 is that its super mutants function like orcs, that is, as inherently violent, monstrous enemies with little moral nuance. I don't think that's necessarily a flaw. From a gameplay perspective, clearly hostile enemy factions serve an important purpose. Fallout 3 is structured around exploration and combat, and it benefits from having threats the player can engage without constant moral negotiation. In that sense, super mutants fill a role similar to orcs in fantasy settings. They are a persistent, recognizable danger. The game also includes some nuance. Characters like Fox demonstrate that super mutants are not universally mindless or evil, even if most encountered in the wasteland are hostile. That exception alone establishes that their behavior isn't purely biological destiny. I rarely hear this same criticism applied to Fallout 1. In that game, nearly every super mutant you encounter is openly hostile. The Master's Lieutenant stands out, but not because he is morally complex. He's simply more intelligent and calculating than the other mutants. He isn't a moral counterexample. He's a more cunning version of the same underlying threat. For that reason, I don't think Fallout 3's depiction of super mutants is a betrayal of the series' roots. I personally prefer the approach in Fallout 1, where they function primarily as antagonists rather than as a broadly sympathetic group like in Fallout 2. That's a matter of preference, but it's consistent with earlier Fallout games, so Fallout 3's 3's depiction of super mutants is not a departure from how the series portrayed them in the past. So the issue isn't that super mutants are hostile. The issue is that the game doesn't clearly explain why most of them are hostile, whether it's cultural conditioning, institutional structure, or the intentions of whoever created them. Clarifying that distinction would add depth without undermining their role as enemies. A lot of people dislike Elder Lyons' version of the Brotherhood of Steel, but I actually think the Brotherhood is handled fairly well in Fallout 3. The game clearly acknowledges that the Brotherhood has historically been an isolationist organization. Rather than ignoring that legacy, Fallout 3 builds it directly into the narrative through the Brotherhood outcasts, members who disagreed so strongly with Lyons' priorities that they broke away from the Citadel. That internal schism makes it explicit that Lyons' leadership is a deviation, not a misunderstanding, of traditional Brotherhood doctrine. This is reinforced by the fact that the West Coast Brotherhood cuts Lyons' chapter off from official support. The game makes it clear that his Brotherhood is viewed as having gone rogue. That detail undercuts the idea that Bethesda simply turned the Brotherhood into a generic good guy faction without recognizing what they were changing. More importantly, Lyons' shift away from strict isolationism makes sense in the context of the Capital Wasteland. Unlike the Brotherhood in California, this chapter operates in a region overrun by super mutants with no functioning nation-state to provide stability. Actively recruiting, protecting settlements, and cooperating with locals becomes a practical necessity if the Brotherhood wants to survive and maintain a long-term presence. It's perfectly fair to dislike this direction and prefer how the Brotherhood functioned in Fallout 1, but that's a matter of preference. It's much harder to argue that Fallout 3's portrayal doesn't follow its own internal logic, or that it contradicts the broader canon about the Brotherhood. I also think the good and evil karma system in Fallout 3 is far too simplistic, and that the game's attempt to judge player actions often undermines player agency rather than supporting it. The core problem is that the game frequently makes moral judgments for the player instead of allowing the player to decide what their actions mean. A good example of this happens very early on in Megaton. Hacking into Moriarty's terminal is treated as an evil act by the karma system. But in context, that judgment doesn't really hold up. The player character has just emerged from the vault with no possessions, no understanding of the outside world, and no leverage. Moriarty immediately takes advantage of that vulnerability by extorting the player for information about their father. In that situation, sneaking into his office and accessing his terminal to find out where your father went isn't an act of cruelty or malice. It's self-preservation. The issue isn't that players shouldn't face moral consequences. It's that Fallout 3 often reduces complex situations into binary moral labels. By assigning universal good or evil values to actions regardless of context, the game closes off role-playing possibilities instead of expanding them. To be fair, this design choice makes sense in its historical context. In 2008, having a visible morality system was still seen as an innovative feature for RPGs, and it was something publishers could easily market. But Fallout 3 didn't actually need a numerical karma system to support moral choice. The game already allows quests to be resolved in multiple ways, with consequences reflected through dialogue, faction reactions, and world state. Removing the karma system wouldn't mean removing morality. It would mean trusting the player to interpret their own actions. And while I do still find the exaggerated "you've lost karma" sound effect funny, the system itself creates some absurd results. You can become evil by repeatedly logging in and out of Moriarty's computer, then immediately buy your salvation by donating money to a cult leader who worships an atomic bomb, an act the game categorizes as unquestionably good. Fallout 3 is often compared to New Vegas, largely because both games were built on the same engine and released only a few years apart, but despite those similarities, they prioritize very different strengths. In terms of exploration, I think the Capital Wasteland is more interesting than the Mojave. Fallout 3 leans heavily into a ruined post-apocalyptic atmosphere with dense urban destruction and highly memorable locations. New Vegas is at a disadvantage here simply because it's set in a desert region. There are fewer ruins to explore, and the game leans more towards a Wild West aesthetic than a traditional post-nuclear apocalypse. Where New Vegas clearly outperforms Fallout 3 is in its main quest and faction writing. On the surface, the two games can even sound similar. New Vegas is about the NCR and Caesar's Legion fighting over Hoover Dam, while Fallout 3 is about the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave fighting over Project Purity. Both stories begin with searching for a person and then escalate into a larger faction conflict. The difference is player agency. New Vegas allows the player to meaningfully choose between multiple outcomes and factions, while in Fallout 3 you have to work with the Brotherhood to finish the main quest. You will always end up fighting the Enclave, even if the game briefly allows the illusion of cooperation, such as following President Eden's instructions with the FEV vial or choosing not to destroy Raven Rock. The Brotherhood-Enclave conflict in Fallout 3 is fun to play, but largely uninteresting outside of its immediate spectacle. By contrast, the NCR Legion conflict in New Vegas remains compelling even after you stop playing, because it's woven into the fabric of the entire Mojave. On paper, the factions in both games occupy similar narrative roles. The NCR and the Brotherhood are both good factions with serious flaws. The NCR is idealistic but crippled by bureaucracy, corruption, and overreach, while Elder Lyons is compassionate but divisive, pulling the Brotherhood away from its traditional mission at a great cost. Likewise, Caesar's Legion and the Enclave both function as overtly villainous factions that nevertheless possess strengths their rivals lack, whether that's the Legion's discipline and unity or the Enclave's technological superiority. What makes New Vegas's conflict more memorable is how deeply it affects the entire game world. Nearly every major group in the Mojave has an opinion about the war. Settlements like Good Springs, factions like the Powder Gangers, and the Great Khans, traders, casino families, and even minor NPCs all reflect how the NCR Legion conflict shapes their lives. This depth is conveyed largely through dialogue rather than massive quest chains. By contrast, Fallout 3 rarely shows how its central conflict impacts the wider wasteland. Outside of a few isolated comments, such as Dr. Lee's distrust of the Brotherhood or Nathan's misplaced admiration for the Enclave, most NPCs have very little to say about either faction. The war itself is effectively confined to the battle over Project Purity, especially if you exclude Broken Steel. That difference highlights why New Vegas's world building feels richer. It isn't because it has dramatically more content, but because its factions are consistently acknowledged across the game world. A few additional lines of dialogue can go a long way toward making a conflict feel real. Ultimately, it's the factions and world building that make New Vegas more memorable than Fallout 3. But that doesn't mean Fallout 3's core plot structure is inherently flawed. While New Vegas centers on political alignment and faction choice, Fallout 1 and 2 show that a Fallout story can be equally compelling when it focuses on a personal quest against an existential threat. The Vault Dweller leaves Vault 13 to stop the Master and his mutant army, and the Chosen One leaves his tribe to rescue his people from the Enclave. In that context, it makes sense for the Lone Wanderer to have a defined background as a Vault resident. Even the presence of a parent in the story isn't unusual. The Chosen One's mother appears in Fallout 2. Because of this, Fallout 3 works best when viewed as a hybrid between these approaches. For most of the game, the Lone Wanderer is not aligned with any faction but is instead pursuing a personal goal, finding their father. Only later does the narrative expand into a broader faction conflict, as the player begins working with the Brotherhood and is given limited opportunities to cooperate with the Enclave through President Eden. The problem, then, isn't that Fallout 3 failed to imitate New Vegas. It's that the game never fully integrates its factions into the story structure that it already has. The foundation was already there. What Fallout 3 needed wasn't a new plot, but stronger factions and deeper world building to make that plot believable. This has been part 1 of Fallout 3, What It Could Have Been. In the next videos, we'll dive into how the factions could have been stronger, how the main quest could have been more compelling, and a rewrite of the DLCs. If you're enjoying this series, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest. I have a post-apocalyptic comic that I think fans of Fallout would appreciate. If you were interested in checking it out, the link is in the description. Thanks for watching.